Welcome to High Strangeness, where we ask questions and explore all that is strange and unexpected in our reality.
Welcome to High Strangeness. I am your host, Tony, and this is the place where we talk about all things strange and unexpected. Today, we're going to talk about something that is strange and mysterious for many years. And I'm excited because I have an awesome fellow here that I'm going to interview today who has a wealth of knowledge and will teach us some things about Bigfoot. So I'm excited. I have Daniel Perez here today, and someone who has been in the thick of the Bigfoot phenomena since at least 1979. I personally was still in junior high in 1979, so I know Daniel's heard a lot of things, and I hope I can get that information today for all of us. He's also the editor and publisher of a newsletter called the Bigfoot Times. It's been running for 26 years straight, and the amazing thing is I know that he's also been publishing some things since, I think, 1979 1979. So that's like 45 years. So we'll get into that. But you have definitely been involved in this topic for a very long time, and I'm excited to have you on the show. I know the amount of information you have been exposed to and are aware of is going to be a great benefit to me and our audience as we try to learn about Bigfoot. So, sir, how are you doing today?
I'm doing just fine. I was looking forward to this point in my day, and tell you earlier today, right after work, there was a fellow. I'm going to jump in my email real quick here.
Sure.
A fellow by the name of Adam RUF, I think. He's an amateur photographer, but he came to visit me right after work, and we met at In-N-Out Burger. And I asked him, "You want to get photos of me?" And he says, yes. And he heard a podcast of me being interviewed. And so he wanted to come down and meet me real quick to get some photos. And he had this gigantic camera, the one that you probably see from the 1920s, 8 by 10 inch format, and with the massive tripod. And I got a photo of it with him. And so according to him, I'm the first Bigfooter to be photographed in that format, because I've never been photographed in that 8 by 10 format. And it was kind of fascinating. We went down to the park to take the photos, and it was quick and easy. And so I told him, I said, well, later to be on a podcast. And I showed him, because maybe he didn't necessarily believe me because it's the first time he met me.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess last week, I guess the Discovery Channel or somebody called, and this was from back east, and they want to do something on the Yeti, the abominable snowman. And they said, you're the perfect person to be on it. And they interviewed me a little bit. So
Nice.
in an exciting couple of days.
Yeah.
So, and here's the thing. I try to, as I tell people who listen to me, I said I try to fly under the radar screen, but I guess I haven't been too effective.
Well, look, somebody who's got your background, come on. It's going to be tough to stay under the bushes there. So, sir. No, go ahead.
We had the 25th anniversary edition of the Bigfoot Times newsletter last year. And in the 25th anniversary edition, and I'll tell you too, I said, my best answer to most of your questions is, I don't know. And
Right.
And with that, I also wrote, I said, the people that are telling you they've got it all figured out about where they're going to see a Sasquatch, when, and all the details, it's like they have failed to prove that they know what they're talking about. So you're better off saying that I don't know, which is a good, honest answer.
Right. And around this phenomena, it is very tough to nail down, I bet. So let me ask you real quick. So you live in California?
I live in California.
Awesome. And are you a native from California?
Born and raised here in Norwalk, California, which is a suburb of the Los Angeles area in Los Angeles County.
Cool. And maybe tell us a little bit about you, your upbringing, like what got you into this subject?
What really triggered my interest when my parents dropped us off to go to a walk-in theater, my older brother and older sister. And we were at that phase, I was 10 years old and kind of into the Godzilla movies, the monster movies, terror and all that good stuff. And so I thought at least the Legend of Boggy Creek, I thought it was going to be like this real monster movie. And so we went to go see it, and all I can say is that movie hit me like a ton of bricks. And that's what vaulted me into my current interest into Bigfoot. They were talking about the Fouke monster in Arkansas, and I couldn't necessarily connect that to Bigfoot because I didn't even know what Bigfoot was at the time. But within, I guess, a few months or maybe a few years, I got to the library and started figuring out this Fouke monster thing, in which you're watching the movie The Legend of Boggy Creek. You kind of get the impression that the narrator wants to take you to take the matter seriously because it was a pseudo-documentary. And so I did, even at age 10. And so I started looking into it a little bit, and sure enough, I found some books on Bigfoot, or the librarian directed me in that direction. And so I kind of put two together, and I said, well, what they're probably talking about, the Fouke monster, is probably just a Bigfoot, but by a different name. And so that's what really got me going, and that was 1973, and so I was 10 then, I'm 60 now, and so I've stuck with it ever since, and I've seen just about everything there is to see.
I'm looking to pull some of that from you today. I can't wait to hear about it.
So that's how I got started, and because it just, how can I say it? Back then there was no internet. So my father, who was an electrical engineer, he used to get the newspaper. It was either, I guess, the Press-Telegram or the Los Angeles Times. And so when he was done, he'd just leave it on the table, and so I started going through it, and every once in a while there was a newspaper clipping about Bigfoot. And so we used to get our shoes at JCPenney, and you had the little shoe box. And so that's how my original file cabinet is. I started putting the newspaper clippings that I clipped out from the newspaper, and I put them, that was my first collection of newspaper clippings in the JCPenney shoebox. And so that was my first filing system for all things Bigfoot. And now, this many years later, I have the world's largest physical files on the subject matter.
Wow, I believe it. That's a young age to start, and it just hooked you, didn't it?
It hooked me like you wouldn't believe, and so I could never really. Of course, I was interested in other things like the UFOs, Bermuda Triangles, all the Loch Monster, the whole 9 yards, but I realized that I was watering myself down, and I wanted to focus just on the Bigfoot subject because I just felt it had a real chance of being real. And at the time when I went to the library, I got two books, one by John Green and one by Don Hunter with Renee DeHinden. And in both of those books, it had a place to write to the author in the back of the books. And so, needless to say, I wrote to both of them, and they wrote back. And so, had they not written back, I may have not have been as interested. And this is all back in the snail mail days. And so, and it was quite funny because I plugged into two, even today, since they're passed away, even today, two of the biggest, most legendary Bigfooters on the face of the planet.
That's
right
amazing.
out its gate. Renee DeHinden and John Green.
That's not just luck. That's almost
I thought it was meant to be.
meant to be.
So I became their protege, and it's just like between the both of them, you could see the different types of styles. John Green was more schooled, and Renee Hinden was more, what's the saying? Shoot from the hip. Two different styles of investigators and researchers. But still, even today, we're still talking about those two people.
So there are bits and pieces of each of them that you really admired and learned from.
In terms of the field investigator, Renee was 10 times that of John Green. In terms of the academic scholastic researcher, John was 10 times more than Renee, because John had the formal education and Renee had the informal education, very little education, and he spent a good chunk of his life recycling lead shot pellets for the shotguns at the Vancouver Gun Club. And so he said to me on more than one occasion, it says, you really don't have to think about anything, you just do. And it allowed you to think about other things. And he said, spend my free mind time thinking about Bigfoot. And he says, there's not a day that goes by that I didn't think about the subject matter. And so at the same time, concurrently, I had other investigators that I was colleagues to, notably Dr. Grover Krantz and also Peter Byrne. And again, all four of these individuals are gone now. But I had postal communications with all of these people in the 1970s.
What did they think about such a young man being interested?
Don't think they knew. I don't think they knew my age, and I kind of didn't want to tell them because I thought maybe, well, they're just wasting time with a kid, and so I didn't want them to think that, and so that's how things worked out. And later I would eventually meet all of them.
That must have been cool. What did you say when you met them?
Just hello. It was very interesting because I met Renee first, and then I met, I believe, John Green second, and then eventually Peter Byrne. And right around the same time I met John Green, in 1989, I also met Dr. Grover Krantz.
Cool.
And in fact, believe it or not, it was the annual cryptozoology group, International Society of Cryptozoology, at their general meeting, and I think that was in June of 1989. And so when I flew into Pullman, Washington for the meet, I had phoned Grover Krantz just to let him know I was here and that I was going to attend the meet. And so by then we had quite a few exchanges by postal mail because that's the only way you could communicate. There was no such thing as email. And to my utter surprise, he said, where are you? At what hotel? What room number? And him and his wife and a graduate student came over to visit me. So I was just delighted.
That's pretty cool and very memorable.
I wish I would have had pictures of that moment. I've got pictures of the meet, but I didn't think anything of taking pictures there in the hotel room with them.
That's cool. Like anytime you run across somebody who's got this wealth of information, you've been interacting with them, and then you see them face to face, it must have been special.
It was. So these are things that kind of stick in my mind, and it's just like, and all of the people I have just mentioned were considered the four horsemen of Bigfooting at the time. And so I met them all and had associations with all of them.
What would you say today? Is there still some individuals who are at the top of the study? Or is it...
I think today the people who spend an inordinate amount of time that are really doing, I consider, really good work would be Dr. Jeff Meldrum and Cliff Barrickman. And Cliff is at it full time, And some of the historical things that he's dug up, like in terms of like High Pump, California, 1963, the tracks were seen. He was able to get a hold of some more people that just by happenstance it happened on their property. And so he was able to dig into that, and he was able to dig into some stuff in Bossburg, Washington. And then the Denny, let's see, can't think of the case, but some good tracks were seen that several investigators were involved in, but Cliff was able to interview him on his podcast. It'll probably come to me in a bit, but some very good tracks. And this was a long time ago, 1980 or thereabouts, 1982. I want to say his name was Denny Herford. I could be mistaken. He may have been one of the principals involved, and he tracked him down and interviewed him. And so in terms of historical research and kind of fleshing out some of the older cases, he's done a brilliant job. And so with Dr. Meldrum, he continues to bring up kind of modeling the Sasquatch off of just regular primate behavior. And that seems to make sense because a lot of the things that the eyewitnesses are describing today kind of fall into your typical primate behavior in general of gorillas, bonobos, orangutans, and chimpanzees, except that perhaps we have something that's more exclusive to nocturnal activity than diurnal daytime activity. So I think they've been doing a wonderful job, and there's a lot of other investigators with boots on the ground. B. Mills, for instance, in Ohio, who they've been hitting it hard. And a couple of years ago, 2019, she was the Bigfooter of the Year for the Bigfoot Times, the first and only female ever. And she was investigating tracks in her home state, and some very good tracks. And the tracks, the castings she made, there were dermal ridges that were clearly seen. And I've seen the original castings at her house, and I'm very happy that she did not make duplicates of these, so no one can duplicate it and then go fake something, you know what I'm saying? Use a template. And I was able to study those tracks, the castings, quite a bit. And this is happening in Ohio, 2019, a whole series of events. And she was on top of it and spending quite a bit of her own money in addition to her job, following up on all of this stuff. And it was just a brilliant piece of work. And I told her, kind of like an athlete in their prime, that enjoy every minute of it, because you may be the prime athlete for today, but that only lasts for your entire career, just a few minutes. The rest, you're just an ordinary citizen. And so B. Mills has really been banging it up as well. And there's a lot of people, like you go on Facebook, that are really doing what I would consider serious research.
You mentioned something, the ridges. Could you define that?
Dermal ridges, that's just a fancy scientific term for the fingerprints or the thumbprints or the footprint, the ridges on your fingers, the fingerprints. And so when you're starting to pick up this, it's brilliantly faked, or what you're seeing is really the dermatoglyphics of the individual that left the print, the real deal. And so that's quite interesting, because if this is a fraud, fake, legend, whatever you want to call it, then you wouldn't expect to see that detail in there. Yep. And then another thing too, that most people who gloss over the subject, the skeptics and the debunkers, say, well, it's just a fake footprint. And most people fail to realize that the length to width ratio of the prints that are being seen in the Pacific Northwest and throughout North America generally don't match the length width ratio. You have a foot that's proportionally wider than the normal average. It's not just an expanded person's foot, it's wider than at the ball foot, the front of the foot. So it's almost like similar to man, but a whole different type of architect. It's almost like taking your truck and then saying like, well, let's turn this into an off-road vehicle, and you have to modify the suspension for a heavier load. And the same thing there with the Bigfoot. I mean, if you're 8 feet tall, 800 pounds, you would think that your skeletal features would be a little more heavy duty and that there would be some little subtleties, differences. So in other words, to distribute the weight on your foot, you got to go wider, not just longer. So there's a lot of things there that, to me, indicate that we're dealing with a real biological entity.
Yeah, I mean, that's amazing. That's a subtle thing. But yeah, I'm glad you brought that up to help people realize you need a foot that can support that base.
Right.
Or as a base, I should
say. There's and I could go on and on if I had a notepad and had really extensively did some research in terms of our discussion here. It's all the subtleties in the Bigfoot data that I think ring true overall. And like if you were to go back to the 1924 case from British Columbia with Albert Ostman, the prospector, who died a long time ago, but he had indicated that he didn't have a camera, of course, but that when he was abducted by quote-unquote the big male, that he was taken into a family group, into a bull valley, and there was a big male, a female that looked like its bride, and two offspring, a male and a female. And he described the hand of the male with short, stubby fingers and an elongated palm. And so, say, for instance, that's the only report where you have a handprint. Well, you could just completely brush it aside. But from that point forward, there are other instances that come up that are similar to that. And one in particular, if you drop down to Northern California, Fort Bragg, February of 1963, where there was an incident where one of these left a muddied handprint on the door sill of a home, that when they made the tracing of that, there again, you had a hand that was massive, I think 11 inches from the palm to the top, which is 11 inches long. But there again, it not like a person's hand, had a very extended, the palm was very long, and then the fingers were very, very stubby, and the thumb came out more at a right angle, like so. And it's just like, I don't think that Albert Ostman had any contact with people from Fort Bragg, California. And so you start to ask yourself the question, well, why is it that the Fort Bragg, California has almost the same type of architect when it comes to the hand as Albert Ostman? So then you ask yourself, well, where did Albert Ostman come up with this information if he was fabricating it? And why does it repeat? And then it repeats again in the state of Michigan from the 1970s, I believe. And we've had discussions about this in the newsletter, and it's just like, again, it's those subtleties that, to me, indicate you're dealing with a biological reality, not folklore, fabrications, or people that are drinking.
I'm wondering, that size of hand, is that comparable to anything else? Apes or anything like that?
No, quite a bit bigger. Quite a bit bigger than an ape's hands. But apes have similar hands. Gorilla has probably the most similar hand to a Sasquatch, in my opinion. But similar,
they have little
twice. Yes, and you look at the handprint of a gorilla, similar to a Sasquatch, but not quite. And so the Sasquatch, because it's upright, and the gorilla is quadrupedal, it's just like the hand has a different function altogether. Instead of using it for walking, that a Sasquatch is using it to manipulate its environment as it goes through.
So let me back up for a little bit, because I want to go where we're going, but I need to ask a couple questions. I want to ask you about your website.
Bigfoot Times.
Yes. And on there, what sorts of information can people get from your website?
Well, a couple of things. One, you could sign up for the newsletter, and it's ridiculously cheap for the United States members, $22.75 for the entire year. And so what the subscriber gets is not a digital email newsletter. You get a physical paper, ink on paper newsletter that's mailed out every month. So for 12 months, that membership, and you get the newsletter with original information reporting in the newsletter. And so the other thing you could see up to the present time, or mostly to the present time, all the covers of the Bigfoot Times newsletter since its inception from January 1998. And you can scroll and see every cover that we've ever done of the newsletter for a quarter century. And then another thing you could see is we have what I call Project Bigfoot books in there. So Project Bigfoot books, believe it or not, the one guy right here has compiled a bigger compilation of all the Bigfoot books, be it fiction or nonfiction or a coloring book, self-published or published by a major publisher. Project Bigfoot Books has attempted and has already toppled. It's the largest collection of books on Bigfoot ever seen, and you could see everything we know about the books. It's larger in scope than anything the Library of Congress or anyone else has ever done, period. It's the biggest collection of books ever.
I would say that's the first thing I noticed. That list is huge.
Yeah, it's over 1,000 entries right now. I can't give you the exact number. I'd have to look myself, but yeah. So I've been dreaming about that for years, since about 2014, because I noticed on websites such as Amazon that people kept on publishing self-published Bigfoot books, and I said, you know what? No one's really keeping track of all of this stuff, and no one probably has the budget to go out and buy every book. And I said, but we can keep track of it through the internet and through a website. And I said, I want to give it a go. So I had some people build me customized websites so I could do this. And I said, listen, I'm not super savvy on the internet or super savvy on web development or any of that. I just need to know how to plug in information. You guys build it. In other words, you guys build me a super V8 engine so I could go win the race. And so that's what they did. And so I just plug in the information. So I'm just ecstatic about Project Bigfoot books. I mean, I'm a real book guy. I enjoy reading. So that's what it's all about. And I'm sure people go on there and spend hours just looking at all the books and say like, oh, I read this one, or I have this one, or whatever the case may be. The other thing there is there's two specific bibliographies that you could click on. One is about Ape Canyon, 1924, about the incident there. It's the largest bibliography of all the sources I could find. And right now, I can't think of the guy's name, Mark. It'll come to me in a minute. But he's writing a book about the topic right now. And he lives in Oregon, I believe. And then the other is the largest specific bibliography on the Patterson-Gimlin film. And so that spans at least 36 pages, I guess, just by itself. And so if you want to be a rugged scholar and research just the PG film, that's the place to start in that bibliography. So it's kind of like open source information so anyone can access.
That I think people have to go see, because it was amazing. I was like, oh my gosh, there's like more than I've ever seen, honestly.
And then one thing that before the internet really came into the internet, say, back in the dial-up days, it was kind of you and I were there to see the infancy or the start of what we call the real internet, not just some prototype or just a few people using it, but mass development. And it all started out with the dial-up, and then it got a little more sophisticated. But where was it going with that thought? Oh, at the time prior to that, there was a lot of Bigfoot newsletters that were printed and mailed out to memberships from Ohio to California, to Ray Crow's newsletter on Bigfoot. And so people subscribed to those, and it was sent in the mail. And so at that time in late 1997, I heard about these things called laptop computers, and I said, wow, I should get one. And what I want to do, my formula, or what I wanted to do, was another newsletter, because I felt I could do at least as good a job as the other newsletters, but be a little more brief, because you don't have to be long-winded to give out good information. And so I started competing with other people. 25 later, they're all gone.
Yeah.
All their Bigfoot newsletter. And 26 years later, there's only one newsletter standing in time, and I'm behind it.
I love it. That's great. And you're right
So
on this job.
Just the very fact that it survived over a quarter century should tell you something about editor and public.
That's right.
That's why, I guess, for some people, somewhat of a legendary appeal to these people, because
I love it. Thank you for sharing that and spending a minute to talk about that, because there's value in that people need to know. All right, Daniel, I want to talk about Bigfoot again. I want to start basic. Bigfoot goes back how long? Folklore, legends. How far back do you think it goes?
the oral traditions here in North America from the Native Americans, if you were to really research it, and I'm not talking just oral tradition, I'm talking years, perhaps 500 years, as long as that oral tradition is communicated from one generation to the next. Oral Americans, especially specific to just about one in here. They're cohabiting, so it's always been here. And in the newspapers, Jerry Crew and the tracks were found in 1958 in Northern California, or whatever the case. That's the inception. That's the start of the modern. That really is not the case. Chad Orman, author who compiled the historical Bigfoot, I think it's called just that, the historical Bigfoot. He's detailed from every state and the United States where you have instances of reports of these wild hairy men that go back to the 1800s, early 1800s. So this tradition of people seeing things in the woods goes back hundreds of years, just did not start in 1800s. And so a lot of the skeptics and debunkers get that completely wrong. Maybe it is because they're lazy in terms of doing the legwork and the research. Chad Orment has proven everyone says, look, you just look at the actual clipping in public. Hundreds.
It's not a new thing, that's for sure.
Not a new thing. This is something that has been going on for hundreds of years here in North America. It's fascinating because there are reports of them being killed. Smoking gun, and that anyone ever hung to a bone or anything like that. We don't have any physical of it. And a lot of people, the skeptics and the skeptics and debunkers, don't have any physical evidence because, and I, not necessarily so. I mean, you think about an average person from, say, the early 1800s, and the tale of Daniel Boone, and I guess where they shot a 10-foot creature or something of that nature. It's maybe those people just didn't have the presence of mind to understand killed or buried or whatever in terms of like collecting for a future generation. Maybe they just thought it was some freak of nature. And maybe their understanding of all the things that we understand today, they just didn't have any understanding, and they just, it's the devil, the taboo, and, tradition. We should rid ourselves of anything like this, get away from it, because it's different. Not realizing this is the find of the century.
And the indigenous people, they don't even question that this is a reality. They know it is.
Yeah.
I think that's amazing right there. We need to listen to some of that.
And David Paulides, when he and wrote about it. But that was a brilliant book, and that was an opportunity for people who were studying the big phenomenon to understand that here in this small reservation up in Northern California, not too far from where the Patterson, that he cataloged all these reports from people with not just anonymous sources, with their names attached to the report. That was a deep dive. And
I'm going to shift the direction here a little bit. You kind of mentioned this a little bit, and my question goes here. Bigfoot, just North America? Or just sections of North America? Or is there good evidence that it's everywhere?
I would say they're not good at oral tradition or oral testimony that seems to be spread around the globe. I mean, you have reports coming from Russia, from even reports from Kingdom, from Canada, and reports from South America. And when you start to think about it, it seems like, well, because it is so widespread, obviously it must be just old folklore that people have invented these and passed on from generation to generation, because that it is just that, folklore. But I disagree with that. Really behind it. And if you were just to go to Northern California, where the PG got, and you get in hundreds or thousands of acres, a lot of that area is just woods upon woods upon woods, and creeks and boulders, and just all sorts of nasty territory. That would be a perfect environment for it. So when I was in Canada, with John Green and Tom Steenberg, we went out, I want to say this was 1997 or 1998, to the Mike McDonald report, Bear Hunter. He had a scope on one of these things, and he really didn't think these things existed. So we went out to that area. And so I think John Green was born in British Columbia, but he said once he passed Vancouver, that in British Columbia, which is a massive province, that he said all of this, all the way to the end of the province, is just woods and woods and woods, and anything could be out there, and then you just have trucks and occasional logging roads and forest maintenance roads, and it's just all wood. And it's fun to think that there could be nothing there is to be extreme.
I mean, it's interesting because I live in Utah, and we don't have the greenery, which can hide a lot of things, but we do have the mountains and stuff, and there are areas that probably hardly ever have been explored. And so I know that's the case Pacific Northwest and to Canada. It's got to be crazy. Very few people.
Especially like if you fly over the United States in different directions, north or west to east, whatever the case. And say you live in a big city, Los Angeles, New York, or Omaha, whatever the case may be. There in the plane, and you start looking down, you see these men that are just all forested, and you don't see any detection buildings or anything. That's how big North America is. That's the potential of North America in terms of it's immense. And most people don't realize that because they are stuck to a city or a small town, and they never realize around
them. With these different, how should I refer to them? Animals, beasts? What's the best way to refer it to these?
Whatever is bipeds, hairy bipeds, unknown primates.
Unknown primates. Because some places in the world, they're described as all white or red or dark hair. Do you think they're related?
Well, you would have to do your question specifically in terms of relation to one another. You'd have to do a deep DNA analysis and the DNA there to like, okay, this is where the abominable snowman or the Yeti ties in with Bigfoot, or they're so distinctly different that they're not cousins. They're just unknown primates. You might have common stock. I mean, you think about it, from South America to North America, to Russia, Australia. I mean, even if they were that started it all and were related at one time to it would have to be very distinct species.
Yeah.
That's my guess. And I think if we poured the proper amount of manpower and financial resources, we could get to the thing. And John Green had often, if we could put him in, we could find. And it took billions of dollars to get to the moon. Research here into finding Bigfoot, and I'm sure we could do it. It's not just one individual. I think.
Yeah. I wonder what you think about the people out there well, let me ask it this way. What is a common misconception about Bigfoot Sasquatch?
Because most people who have just a passing interest on the subject matter, if there's only one, and that happening in, say, 1958, then they said, well, how can that thing still be alive today? And I think that's probably the biggest misconception, is a lot of people who are not in the matter, they have this misconception that and perpetuate. And if you were to get into the subject matter, breeding and a species, there would have to be population.
That makes sense.
And the biggest misconception I think about the abominable man, white, and they're dark colored individual term hair that people, but because in popular on television, internet, or whatever the case may be, white abominable snowman or Yeti, that people have that misconception.
Yeah. And it's funny that you went there. I was going to ask the question at some point about how you thought maybe media and movies and things like that impact the way people think about this.
I mean, look at Steven Spielberg's Harry and the Hendersons. Came out in 1987. But one thing that, fake and fabrication and folklore, you would think that in 1987, once every millions of people went to go see Steven Spielberg's Harry and the Hendersons, that a lot of people there would be like a zillion sightings right after it. Case. Just because you had a major theatrical release, that didn't put on the map a whole bunch of more reports. So it didn't necessarily influence what people were at.
I love that movie, by the way.
And I think maybe the misconception by Harry and the Hendersons, dealing with a very tame Bigfoot harm, you have to realize these things have to eat too. They don't go into the supermarket and live off the land. And Matt Moneymaker and the BFR website have demonstrated these individual Bigfoot as species would have to, in terms of getting it, and a massive predator, the number one meat source in North America, deer. And they are doing what they need to do to get that protein in their body to perpetuate and fit well. And that right there, it's just like, well, what do they eat? How do they eat? Is there enough food out there? And the answer is yes. And then you look at the types of berries out there and fruit. And why are they seeing, say, in the Midwest states or the Eastern states, reports coming out of where their crop and into the corn crops or whatever the case may be, and raiding their crops when the people aren't looking. And so, yeah, they have figured out a strategy how to survive, raid their chicken. Well,
where we went here is exactly where I want to go. Interested in the characteristics of the Yeti or the Bigfoot, the Sasquatch. What can we teach people about them? I want to start off with vocalizations first. Is there anything you can tell us about that?
Well, there's a guy, again, because I'm not in daily touch with him, I believe in the state of Washington. The name came to me, I'd say media. David Ellis is, but he's writing a book about Bigfoot vocalizations and what it all means. And that, so I guess it's his contention, the long and short of it. Not only do they have vocalizations, I mean, a dog and a cat has vocalizations, a meow and a bark. And what it all means, but the vocalization by itself doesn't necessarily mean you have the ability to speak or having speech. In terms of Homo sapiens, speech is one of the defining characteristics of why we call ourselves human and different from all the other primate species. It's David Ellis' contention that, especially demonstrated in the Sierra sounds from California, Al Berry's tapes. We have something there that is speaking, and that thing is responding and speaking. Does this mean that they are all? If you just look at them, the basic Sasquatch, not out. And so, if they are human and we are human, then the boundary of what human means has got to be pushed further out. What I'm essentially saying, or maybe what David is arguing in his book, speech, thing that we are, perhaps they're primate. So that just tells the level of intelligence, words to connect. And so think about that. You're intelligent. And so far, they would offspring grow up, and the adults would tell them who we are, and that we are a threat to them from that, etc. Knocking down our woods or building roads in our area, and we need to stay clear of it.
It is interesting because what little I know about this subject, I am very impressed that these beings are very intelligent. It seems like they are. We're not giving them enough credit.
I would completely agree. And then if you were to step aside from just Bigfoot for just a moment and look at primates, and it's almost like when we, as Homo sapiens, started to stand upright on a habitual basis and started to walk upright, that gave us freedom with our hands and our arms, and perhaps expanded our brains better. on all fours, and them because here they are on 2 feet. They're not inventing. What I'm saying is that there's a lot of intelligence there, but mastered fire. So to stay warm in the wintertime, okay, if they really are so bright, why aren't they lighting fires and staying warm? So what I'm saying is they're intelligent, certain going beyond. So the answer to that question.
Interesting. I am curious about wood knocks. Just prior to our meeting, I sent you
I
an
saw it.
email. Did you get a chance to watch it?
I watched part of it. I guess it was.
No, it's from Alaska. It's my son-in-law's brother that was there, and he sent it to us first. And I'm curious if that's what that was. It was odd.
I don't know because you don't see anything, but you.
Yeah.
What, in terms of wood knocks, that's something very commonly associated. What it all means, I'm not certain, but it's in communication from the valley to when you're here and then on the other one here. And this is their way of saying, oh, I'm over here, Joe. Meet me here at 4 a.m. and let's go for some beers or whatever.
Yeah. So it's not intimidation. It is likely communication between them.
I would think. Or perhaps it might even be a territorial signal. But my guess is if you were to have a communication device amongst themselves, or the high-screamed whistle, you would often hear that are with. They're communicating with one another, like I'm here, or I'm looking for a mate, or looking for a playmate, or looking for. And let's get together and talk. Literally.
The things you've been made aware of, is it are you believing that maybe they're aggressive or passive?
Probably mostly passive. Aggressive if they need to be, because they're here in North America where people maybe get too close. And I mean, you think about it, if you're out in the woods and between grizzly bear and its young, good possibility that it'll charge you and tear you apart because of instinctual behavior. And the same thing with the Bigfoot. I mean, if it's got old that perhaps is walking by the time, maybe 100 meters from them, and for whatever reason you stumbled in between them, and the mother sees you, there's a good possibility that behavior will be demonstrated towards or against you. And again, it's instinctual behavior that's kicking in.
Yeah. I want to talk about families in a minute, but first, do we think they're territorial in a way like, get out, I'm going to throw rocks at you, leave, kind of a thing?
I would say maybe, but in terms of the population density of Bigfoot, I don't see if there's necessarily a need to be, because there's so much land and so few of them,
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, just in the state of California, say for instance, there's 20 or 24, 2 dozen in California. They could spread it, and each one of them have thousands of acres themselves. No necessary need to be territorial.
That makes sense. I wanted to ask about families. Has there been reports of seeing young ones or even a group of a family?
In fact, after 1924 with Albert Hall, there, now everything that I heard about Albert Hall, from Renee to Hinden and John Green, it seemed like it was poor. Even though towards Renee's end of his life, he started to doubt it for very. But there was a small family group. And what was happening with Al Berry and his tapes, it was his contention and Ron Moore. If you can, well, Todd Neese's report, where I guess it was in April of 1990, where observed for the survey, whatever, I guess, in Oregon, and he saw 3 of them, I guess a mining pit or an explosive pit. Very likely that the 3 individuals were on 1967 to Bluff Creek and Blue Creek prior to PG Mountain. There was a 15-inch track, the 13 track. And then Patty was the 14 and a half. 4 different individuals. And how the crow flies from Blue Creek Mountain to the Patterson-Gimlin film site just straight across. That's operated by 5 air miles. You're a Bigfoot. And that was probably a small family. Even though Patty was seen by herself and filmed by her, she was probably part of that family group, and she was probably looking ahead or doing her own thing, or probably part of.
Yeah.
So, business of the small family groups, if you start to look at there.
I mean, that makes sense, right? I mean, they're not a single being, so there's got to be some kind of group.
Well, here's the thing. When John Green wrote his book in 1978, Sasquatch Things, he kind of modeled the Sasquatch after the orangutan, that solitary individual going about. Being single out in the woods isn't necessarily to, say, for instance, got caught between 2 grizzly bear and you're all by yourself as a Sasquatch. It might be the end of you, but if you're with a small group within screaming distance or whatever, you put out the sound that help, help, help.
Yeah.
Sasquatch might say, and help. And probably, like, even though they seem to be seen by themselves, it's probably Sasquatch very by.
Daniel, how big do these guys get? Is that like 6 to 10 feet or something?
There have been reports of up to 10 feet. I mean, the last person to do anything with statistics in terms of size was John Green and Henner Fehrenbach, which came later in the late 1990s after Henner Fehrenbach. You know, they were talking about the heights of these 9-10 foot tall. I wouldn't have a problem with at all. That's really gigantic in picture, and you're probably talking about a big male, big alpha male. And when you're that big, I don't think you're going to have any natural enemies in the woods. You're the king of.
Yeah, that's massive.
Yeah, people don't realize. If just say, for instance, you're 8 feet tall, and it's not going to take very long to do a Google search on Bigfoot. The people who've seen an 8 foot tall, they all stated that the width of the shoulders was like 4.5. It's unbelievably big.
Yeah, it's not like a basketball player that's tall and skinny.
Yeah, you and I have never seen a person 8 feet tall to begin with in person. Not in person. And you just don't realize how big that is until you're standing right.
And then the width, too.
That's a very. probably part of there's extreme one generation to the next. Fires.
Are these reported in more one color than another?
Dark brown, black, reddish color, red brown. Those are the reports that seem to be most common. But I'm no Bigfoot statistician, but the darker colors seem to crop up more.
And what have you heard about odor?
Not all reports indicate that there's odor, but then again, you have to realize how close was the observer. I mean, you and I could be across the street from someone who's homeless and live their lives in the streets, and maybe they've been like that for a year, but if we're across the street from them and the wind is going the opposite direction, we might not pick up any smell whatsoever. So the same thing with the Sasquatch, it's just like, how close were you to the subject? And when you look at the PG film, Patterson and Gimlin, they both detected an odor, but they were within probably a little close, within 100 feet. And the wind was going downstream, and so it was kind of coming into them, so they were able to detect an odor. And but not all reports indicate an odor.
And I wonder if you're ever, I don't know this, is there reports of Bigfoot climbing? Do they stay ground level, or do they actually get into the trees?
Well, prior to John Green coming on the scene, there was virtually no reports that I remember specifically of these things climbing trees. And it didn't seem like it was a reasonable activity for these things to do. But the more we're starting to learn about the subject matter, it's just like in some of the television programs that are on weekly, there are reports where the individual said that they saw something up in the trees or up in a big tree, and I guess they can climb pretty well. And so I guess you'll have to accept that data. And it's like, you look at the known primates, and they're tree climbers. They can climb trees. So that would be a very good escape route for one of these things to get away real quick, is to go up in the trees and just lie silent.
Yeah, and I guess, and it wouldn't be unreasonable if bears can climb, primates can climb. It could be.
And then the other thing, so since we're talking about wood, the business about tree structures, it's just like, I have an open mind to it. It's just like, but I think I would have to see better evidence. It's just like, it seemed like if they're capable of picking up these heavy logs or whatever the case may be and making them into teepee structures or whatever, then not only do they have their own weight, but they have the weight of what they're carrying, and you'd think you'd have some massive depressions in the ground in some cases where you'd have really good prints. But I've yet to see a well-documented case where the witness said, yeah, I went out to Oklahoma and I saw this teepee structure or whatever, and clearly it was the Sasquatch. But then where the witness would say, like, oh, and here are all the footprints that were in this area. I've yet to see that connection made. And if they had that connection documented, I'd say, like, oh, that's a very strong case for whoever's doing these tree structures as a Bigfoot. But then again, I must admit that I don't know who's making these tree structures. I'm sure in some cases it's just kids or teenagers having fun, but in other cases I'm not so sure of it. So it's interesting. I try to keep an open mind, but if you go back in the literature and some of the early reports, the tree structures doesn't pop up. I'd sure like to know the first instance, and it's probably not until after the year 2000.
That's interesting, yeah. But you make a great point about the weight and the depression of the animal with what they're carrying. It'd be tough not to have some depression there.
Exactly. And where someone can move away the leaf, say it was leaf or pine needles or whatever, where you could brush away this, said, look at all these depressions, and you can, document that. But I've yet to see that well documented.
Daniel, I'm going to go somewhere really weird, if it's okay.
It's okay.
Here's what I want to ask you. Because I do look into a lot of different phenomena, and I'm new into the scene on a lot of these, but I feel like there's some cross-phenomenal evidence between certain things. Let me give you an example. I was watching something on Bigfoot not too long ago. It was last year. And they had some infrared tech that they were using. So they were somewhere in, I think, Alaska, and they caught some heat signatures. And I looked at the body from across a river, and it was peeking around a tree. And they were able to follow it, and then it disappeared. Like, no heat signature at all. And I'm wondering, only because I've heard this somewhere else, is it possible that there is a capability to jump in between dimensions or something like that? This is how they're able to get away so quickly. Any thoughts about that? It's extreme.
That's okay if it's extreme. Here's the thing about that. It's just like, if you were to accept that Bigfoot is just a natural animal like all the rest of the animals on the planet, I mean, you don't see gorillas doing that. They don't blink in from one area and then say a sharpshooter's got a gun on its head and all of a sudden blink out to another area. A grizzly bear doesn't do that. A beaver doesn't do that. A giraffe doesn't do that. So why would I think that a Bigfoot would do that? I think in those instances, perhaps, you're picking up a heat signature with an infrared gun and all of a sudden it seemingly disappeared. So maybe it started crawling on the ground and you weren't able to see it well enough for its escape. And you think, wow, it's definitely it definitely went into a different time portal or zone or whatever. I just personally can't accept that. I find a hard time accepting that. I think the people that are buying into that are quitters in the sense that they're lazy in terms of being a researcher.
No, I appreciate that. Because I've seen some of that discussion recently, and it's tough to know because I haven't been around the subject too long. So I'm curious. That's why I was curious, because I know you've been around this for a while. So, yeah. Okay, I want to ask, what is your best explanation for the existence of Bigfoot and their separation from the rest of us? Like, they're not easily seen, but there are lots of sightings. So they're just smart enough to stay away. Do you think that's what it is?
Yes and no, because, people claim to see them all the time, and not necessarily just the same person, but I think when they're being seen, sometimes, like, I guess earlier this year, there was a video shot in the state of Oklahoma, and there was a lady up on a hill with, I guess, some friends, and it was out in the wide open, and the one that Cliff Barackman discussed from Washington State, from the Umatilla National Forest, I believe. I guess that was earlier this year. And that subject was on a steep hill, but out in the wide open. And so oftentimes it just happens to be that there's an observer there where they're just out in the wide open with not really any forest coverage.
Yeah.
And so I guess if you're in the right place, you could see them out in the wide open, such as Roger and Bob in '67. Yeah. It was out in the wide open. I mean, not necessarily a whole lot of tree coverage. And so it just happens to be like, say, the instance where I believe it was the state of Oklahoma where the witness, a lady, it was on a reservation, that she's filming from the other side of the highway, and it's a pretty distant view, but it's near, I guess, a creek or a waterway, and there are trees, but it's not necessarily in the tree line. It's out in the wide open, and it's probably oblivious to the fact that it's being filmed, or knowing that someone can see it. And I think once it recognizes presence that someone is watching, they'll head for a cover.
I know if I were looking down from the hills at the Hammons, I would say, that's crazy, hairless monkeys. I want to stay away from them. And they may be looking at us and going, they're trouble. Yeah. Let's see here. Don't get me out of this question. Because you have such a pool of knowledge that this question is going to be for people that are maybe just dabbling or listening to this and giving it a moment and saying, is this real? What do you think are the most compelling pieces of evidence that you've heard of, come across, or anything for these Bigfoots and Sasquatches?
Number one by a country mile, and this was over 55 years ago, is the Patterson-Gimlin film. Because here's the facts behind it. You see, you had two eyewitnesses, one with a camera and one with just his naked eye. Two, the other thing that supports that case is the animal reactions, the horses reacted. And horses don't necessarily just, they're instinctual, and so they're not going to bolt just off of perhaps a man in a costume. It's probably not going to do it further. Three, they had the presence of mind not only to see what they saw, but Roger had the presence of mind to film it, so photographic documentation. And then the next point is that footprints were left behind, and the footprints were happening simultaneous as the film was being shot. So the tracks are being laid down not simultaneously, not one thing after the other, in which you can argue it's fake. But the tracks were being recorded as the thing was walking away. And then Roger had the presence of mind to put in a separate roll of film and document the footprints. And most of that second roll of the film of the footprints in the ground has been lost. And probably it's in the BBC vaults in the United Kingdom. But, and then after that, they had the presence of mind to make plaster of Paris castings of the prints to document them. So in terms of the best documented case ever, it would have to go back to Patterson and Gimlin for all the, not just I saw something, but we documented this. And then right after the case, Roger went to the newspaper. So if it were a fake, why would you give away the information? If it were a fake, why would you film in broad daylight? I mean, that would give away everything. You would be filming in the dark or towards the nighttime. And then, so he spoke with the newspaper the same evening, and then he tried to get scientists down there with tracking dogs to track this thing. So that's not indicating that it's a hoax by any stretch. And that other investigators, when he was up in Canada at the UBC to talk about it with the scientific community and the media, that Bob Titmus was there, and he was a Bigfooter. And they told him where to go if he was going to go down there. And matter of fact, he did go down there just, I guess, a week later, less than a week later, and he was on site. So if it were all fabricated, why would you tell anyone? Because a really seasoned investigator like Bob Titmus would have found out real quick, like, oh, this is all bogus. Mm-hmm. When he went to the film site, he found everything was as what Roger and Bob stated. So there was more evidence, the best case ever. And then by Monday, October 23rd, Lyle Laverty was on site. He found out about the incident over the weekend by the newspaper, more than likely. And then when he went up there, he was doing timber management assistant up there, seeing which trees they were going to saw down. And that he found the site on his own, and he photographed some of the tracks. And so he stated in my interview with him that his tracks did not come anywhere near the depth of the tracks that he was looking at. So he said whatever was leaving the tracks was extremely heavy. And so that case by itself, if you could duplicate that 10 times over like those 5 decades where you have cases scattered throughout the United States, the case for the Sasquatch would be very heavy. But we only have one really good film that was shot over 50 years ago, and not a video, a film. And back then there was no CGI or any of that.
Right.
And so what you see on that film is what you get. So that still is today the best evidence ever for the Sasquatch.
And it's good because it's got everything wrapped into one event. Really.
And what some people have done using software and the internet or their laptop computers, they've slowed down the footage and they've stabilized it. And so anyone that could jump onto YouTube, you could really appreciate the subject moving across the sandbar and really appreciate the muscle masses that are moving within the subject. And it's just like for any single person, you could view it in a cleared up way in the sense that they've stabilized the footage and they've slowed it down, and you could really appreciate that, wow, that really looks like a real animal.
Well, and that says a lot when 50-some years later, it's being critiqued. And still, they're finding evidence for its authenticity.
Well, here's the thing. Okay, so the skeptics and debunkers argue that Roger Patterson was out to make a fast buck, so he got a costume from Philip Morris or whoever the case may be, and had someone in a suit and walked this thing, so he made money. Okay, very good. He argue that he created a fabrication. So why aren't people today, hoaxers, doing the same thing and even better, because we have better technology and they could make their own film and go hawk it on the internet or whatever the case may be. Even a better film than Patterson. And no one has been able to produce anything better than them if it were a fake. Because those people too, because they said, well, Roger made money off the film, they could do so too because there's better technology today and no one has done. So right there, for any thinking person, they should think, hey, that's a very good point.
Yeah, because anytime somebody makes money at something, there's always people following up.
Exactly.
Well, I appreciate that. I do want to ask you, do you have any favorite experiences, sightings, reportings, books? What's your favorite that you know what, this is...
My favorite book was published in 1961 by Ivan Sanderson, Abominable Snowman Legend Come to Life. Over 500 pages. And think about it, for someone to write a book in 1961, which means that they were writing the book prior to 61 in the late 50s, to produce something that would come out in 61 without the aid of Google or the internet or any of that stuff, that this was all what you would call a hand job by postal letter. And he was able to capture the global scope of the Bigfoot phenomenon, not just Bigfoot, but the abominable snowman and everything in between. To do that in 1961, and that's far and away the best book ever written. And we talk about that in Project Bigfoot Books on the bigfoottimes.net website. And I would say for anyone who really wants to jump into the subject, get that book and read it.
Daniel, as we start getting towards the end of the interview, what question should I have asked? And you're thinking, I can't believe this guy didn't ask this question. Let me tell you all about this. Okay?
Now, you've covered a lot of ground, but you've never asked about what personally have I encountered.
Yes.
So in 79, myself and Trap were told about some activity in Hemet, California, which you could kind of think of it halfway in between San Diego and Los Angeles. But in 79 or the late 70s, Hemet wasn't a city as it is today. It was just a small one-horse town, very small. And so Dick and June Putnam were reporting things that was later reported to the Riverside Press Enterprise. And so a researcher by the name of Peter Gatella told us about it. And Doug had a car at the time, so he said, well, let's go down one weekend and go talk to these people again. And so we knocked at the door. We may have phoned them, I forget, a long time ago, 79. And we went and knocked on their door and no one was home. So we said, okay, now what? And I said, well, Doug, we've gone all these miles just to get here. Why don't we just look around, because they've reported tracks. And so we started looking around. I mean, no one really knew we were coming. I don't think we phoned until we got there. And then we went to the house and no one was there. And so the road was really rutted because of the heavy rains, and it was all dirt roads. So I told Doug, I said, we should probably stop your car, because if we get stuck in one of these ruts, you're going to have to pull us out. It's going to cost money. So he pulled to the side, and I said, let's just go walking around. Let's go walk down by this little creek that was created by the rain runoff. And we just started looking around, and lo and behold, we're looking down at the creek, and right there on the creek, there was a line of tracks. Was on one side of the creek, crossed, and then kind of went under a dead tree and then walked away. And that was the first line of tracks I've ever seen. And unfortunately, they were kind of mostly washed away by the rains. And so we're looking at the remnants. But on one track, and I made the mistake of putting plaster of Paris in the heel and then taking a picture of it with a 110 Instamatic camera. And what I should have done is taken the photo as it is and then put the white plaster of Paris in to really show the detail. But there was this massive heel print that was clearly there. And I said, geez, this is the heel print of something that's walking right. And so we saw those tracks, and Doug tried to make plaster of Paris castings, but because the plaster of Paris that he had in his car was already damp, it wouldn't set him. So it was a complete failure. But that was the first time we saw tracks, and the idea that someone had planted those tracks for us is just absurd, because we didn't even know we were going to be there. It was just something I said, Doug, why don't we just go look around? Let's just go walk around. And we stumbled upon those tracks. And then in California, in the Monachi Meadows in August of 1986, there were some bridge builders building a footbridge over the Kern River in a certain section up in the Monachi area. And so they were out there for, I guess, a couple of weeks to build this bridge, contracted. And one of these things came off the mountainside at nighttime, and this mountainside was mostly devoid of any trees, was just brush and really wide open. But when you're coming down at nighttime, no one even knows you're coming. It scared the jeebies out of them, and they took their rifle or shotgun and headed back out of the woods. And then I came to investigate with them, I guess about a week later. And then I'm interviewing them at their picnic table that they had built out there. And the guy says, and it left tracks too. And so I stopped the tape. I was doing a taped interview, and I said, oh, it left tracks. Where? And he says, right over here. And I said, well, why don't we just go look at them right now? And by then the tracks were about a week old, and they were about 13 5/8 inches long, and it was sandy soil. But there again, I'm looking at something that was walking right there, and I had no reason to believe these people were doing anything like a hoax or anything like that, because they weren't looking for attention, and they didn't even know I was going to show up.
Right.
They didn't even know I was going to show up, and I showed up, and then they said, here are the tracks, and so I looked at the tracks, took some photos, but again, because they were sandy, there was really no definition to them, but that was the second time I saw tracks, and so that even made me more convinced and more conviction towards the cause, because I'm saying a real animal is going to leave real impressions in the ground. And I was still in my 20s, and by 1986, I had seen 2 sets of tracks. And so if I was hooked already, I was even hooked even more.
Well, and you make a good point. I wasn't sure. I think I was overwhelmed with all the information that I know you've been compiling. In terms of your research, like, are you currently a researcher or an investigator? Or did you do that for part of?
I still do all the things I've talked about. I still research, I still investigate, I still publish the newsletter. And I'm currently working on a book between podcasters about the Patterson-Gimlin film, but this time more of a pictorial book with a lot more information about the case.
Nice.
Because I'm noted grand authorities on the PG film.
I'll tell you, I'm excited that we've had this interview, because I think as people hear this, and even myself as I continue to do research on stuff, I'm going to appreciate even more this interaction. I was impressed already, but as I know more and more about you, I'm going, I'm really lucky here to be having you on this podcast. So
all I could say is I'm the real deal.
Right. Well, what else would you like to share with the group?
Well, I would say if you can afford $23 a year, get the Bigfoot Times water. It's
Right.
the bang for your buck. And it goes in
Absolutely.
postal mail every month,
For 26 years straight.
for 26 years. So that just kind of tells you we're probably not going out of business anytime soon.
All right.
Yeah. So I'm very proud of the fact I've with it all these years. And just the newsletter is just one aspect of what I do. Most people don't even know that I have the largest private library on Bigfoot in the world, just by myself. And so I have the largest physical files, a paper file on Bigfoot in the world, just by myself. And so, but again, I like to fly under the radar screen and probably let other people boast for me rather than me tooting my own horn. But some people like to know, well, what's he all about and what's he got and what cases has he researched, and quite a bit.
Well, I think it's great. I'm sure you've had plenty of other people, like you said, sharing what you've done. But I'm excited to be able to be one of those, to be able to put this information out and just let people know there's a really good person and place to get information.
Well, I think once the podcast is released, that the people who are listening and watching will be absolutely delighted.
I agree.
I think everyone that has any sort of interest in the Bigfoot phenomenon has kind of heard of my name here and there, and so now they have an opportunity to see me and to hear my thoughts on the subject matter.
Well, as I wrap up, and maybe we'll get together at some time down the road, as I end this, I want to ask you to stay online for a few minutes, and so we can talk offline a little bit.
Okay.
Okay. So as we wrap up here, everybody, I just want to remind everybody that there's a lot of strange and unexpected in our reality. Keep your eyes, ears, and minds open, and until next time, stay safe.
Thank you for listening to High Strangeness. This was a glance at some of the strange that exists in our reality.